Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I like to start this program by getting a sense of what your level of experience is having started a vegetable garden or even starting a plant from seed. So how many of you have never started a vegetable garden?
A garden?
Okay, you've grown vegetables.
Most.
That's kind of a cringe.
Well, I grew tomato plants, but I never got any tomatoes.
Okay, I might be able to help you with that. Okay, and how many of you have never started a plant from a seed? So lots of you have experience, so why are you here? So have you had problems that you are hoping? Reproducibility. Okay, well hopefully I can help you with that. So this is a beginner's class, but I like to call it a beginner's plus class. I'm going to cover some of the basics about seed starting and how to begin a vegetable garden, but I'm also going to deliver a lot more information, mainly because I think it's important, and I wish someone had told me some of these things when I first started gardening. You probably won't be able to retain it all, but I'll touch on things that hopefully it'll ring a bell for you. If you have questions or you need clarification, because I might be talking about things you've never heard of before, please feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So this program focuses on starting seeds inside as opposed to starting them out, directly seeding them in the garden. Do you have any idea what the advantages might be for starting seeds inside? Somebody want to volunteer something? Linda?
Well, you can transplant out in your garden sooner than if you just started the seed in the garden.
Right.
So,
So you get an earlier start
harvest.
earlier start on the season. Most seeds, they say, start between 6 and 8 weeks in advance of planting them out in the garden. So that gives you a longer window of opportunity to grow or to produce produce. Anything else?
Controlled environment.
Say it.
Controlled environment.
Exactly. So because you're planting seeds presumably in a controlled environment, you're controlling the heat and the cold, you're controlling the light and controlling the water, you're going to get a better yield of germination. Anything else? Okay, well, you're going to avoid inclement weather. And so, you know, our springs here can be pretty unstable, and this year has been a pretty good example of that. So by starting your seeds indoors and then potting them up into another container a little bigger, like this, you have the opportunity to bring them in and out during this strange weather. You know, you might have a few days of beautiful weather and you think, yes, it's time to put my seeds out my plants out in the garden, and then we get a surprise snowstorm or a surprise frost. So you can, by potting your seedlings up into another container and moving them out during the day or when it's warm, also at night, and then if we get some sudden inclement weather, you can bring them in and protect them. And then you can keep them until you're absolutely sure it's safe to plant them outside. And then finally, you avoid predation. So when you plant your seeds directly in the garden, those rabbits and mice and birds and insects and ground squirrels, they love those tender greens, and they'll just come in and mow everything down unless you really take some serious precautions to protect them. So it's just easier to start seeds inside. So helps to turn it on. Okay, so this is our agenda for today. We're going to talk a lot about seed selection and the terminology and codes in the catalog that will help you with your seed selection. So by careful seed selection, you can address so many things. You can address your personal preferences. What are the flavors and colors and textures that you like? You can address your garden. Perhaps you have a large garden and you can afford to have sprawling and vining vegetables. Or maybe you have a small garden and you have to find plants that are either bred to be smaller or are bush varieties that are appropriate for a smaller garden or even containers. It could be, we can address a lot of issues with regard to temperature. So if you happen to live, let's say, in Jersey-Dale, you only have this little window of opportunity, really, because it's much colder up there, to grow vegetables. And so you can find varieties that have a shorter period of time to produce vegetables and are more cold tolerant. Conversely, if you live where I do, which is like 2,100 feet, we have these extended periods of extreme heat in the summer, and that just takes a toll on our vegetables. So it affects the vigor, it affects the production of the fruit, and it affects sometimes the fruit itself with cracking and blemishes and sunburn. So we can address some of those problems by picking the appropriate variety of plant that's appropriate for your situation. And then finally, you can address disease problems that might happen in your garden. So there are many, many vegetable diseases, and if you ever have one in your garden and you identify what it is, in the future you would buy seeds that are resistant to that type of disease. But in order to do that, we have to kind of understand what the terminologies and the codes are in the seed catalog, so we're going to spend a lot of time on that. Then we're going to talk about how and when to plant seeds and how to transition them into the garden when it's warm enough to put them in the garden. Then we're going to do a little bit of talk on site selection and preparation, so how you choose a site for a vegetable garden, and if you have one, how you would handle your soil in order to prepare it for the coming season. Then we're going to do a little hands-on seeding. We've brought some squash seeds for you today, and I've brought some tomato starts so you can practice transplanting them and you can take them all home. So all of you should presumably have a Johnny's seed catalog at this point. I am not promoting Johnny's seed catalog or seeds as being better than anybody else's seeds, because they're not. But the catalog itself is one of the best out there. It has so much information in it, and I've never seen anything quite as good as it. So I recommend keeping the catalog for future reference. Let's turn to page, we're going to use it as a bit of a workbook. So let's turn to page 16, and that's the carrot section. So down at the bottom you see this green box. Every variety of vegetable and flower in this catalog has a green box giving you everything you need to know about growing out whatever the particular variety is. So how warm the soil should be, when you should plant them outside, how to plant them, what the diseases might be, what the pests might be, when to harvest it, and if it's a storage kind of thing like a carrot, how to store them. You'll also notice down at the bottom, because this is pertinent to what we're going to use in the future, there's all these little codes and icons which will tell you, if you look at the variety, if there's an appropriate code for it, you could just look down here and see what that code is. And also in the green box is a section for resistant codes. So as I mentioned earlier, when you have diseases, let's say you have powdery mildew, you would look for varieties that would have a PM, and you would find whatever those codes are on each variety's page. Not everything has diseases, but most things do. And then up above, they have these great charts that show you how the vegetables might look. For instance, the beets, they have them cut open so you can see what they look like inside. In this case, I look at this and I think, oh, if you have rocky soil or you have clay-like soil, you typically couldn't grow carrots, but you might try this little Atlas variety because it's very short, and if you have shallow soil, it would be appropriate in that kind of a situation. Also, if you see Bolero here, that's highlighted, this is Johnny's seeds indication for anything that's really easy to grow. So if you're a beginner, you might start by choosing varieties that are highlighted by Johnny's seeds. Let's turn the page 2 more pages, and that's the cauliflower page. So on the left-hand page, page 21, they have these charts in certain situations that tell you the varieties that are appropriate for spring, summer, fall, whatever. And to my surprise, I never realized that cauliflower could be grown during the summer. I always thought it was a cool season crop. So here it is, right here, telling you that warm summer varieties are indicated here. Also, here's another example of how all the produce is pictured and compared to along the top here. So we're going to start with terminology, and all of you have a handout with the terminology on it to take home. So heirlooms, hybrids, and open pollinated. It's kind of a murky area and a lot of people get confused by it. An heirloom is a plant variety that is at least 50 years old and was usually developed before World War II. In the case of an heirloom, the parents are of the same variety, or they're self-pollinating. So for instance, a tomato typically is a self-pollinating vegetable. It has male and female parts in the flower, and the flower is kind of closed off so the pollen doesn't escape very easily, so that would be considered a self-pollinating variety. If we turn to, let's see here, the corn page is an example, page 28. Middle column right at the top, it's called Nothstein dent. This is an heirloom. You could see it's an organic OG, and the HL next to it indicates it's an heirloom. The seeds that you get for this variety of corn came from a plant whose parents were both Nothstein dents. I hope that makes sense. An heirloom is a plant that's produced when the parent plants are of the same species, let's say a tomato, but of different parents that are intentionally crossed to produce the best characteristics of each. So like color, flavor, shelf life, disease resistance. An example of that is one of my favorite tomatoes is called a Brandy Boy. And it's a cross between a Brandywine tomato, which is a very well-known, very flavorful heirloom tomato, and it's crossed with another variety, which is a proprietary, they don't tell us what it is, that has more disease resistance and better quality production and fruit. And it produces a Brandy Boy, which has the great flavor of the Brandywine, but the disease resistance, the vigor, and the yield, production yield of whatever that other tomato was. Open pollinated are plants that are either self-pollinated, like the tomato, or pollinated naturally by wind, insects, or the gardener who's intentionally pollinating something. And the parent plants are the same variety. So for instance, a green zebra tomato, the seeds that you get came from a green zebra tomato whose parents were both green zebra tomatoes. So it's very much like an heirloom, it's just not an old variety. Does that make sense to everybody? F1 and F2. Okay, so let's look at page. We're going to stay on this page for a while. 117. You'll see that many, many, many of these tomatoes, next to their name, let's look at the top one, New Girl. In parentheses, it says F1. That means it's a hybrid. So if it doesn't have an F1 next to it, it'll either say HL for heirloom, or it will be an open pollinated variety. F2 you should never see in a catalog. Don't buy it online if you see an F2. F2 is the next generation, and breeders code their subsequent generations with F2, F3, F4, and so on. So only buy an F1 or don't buy an F2 and beyond. Let's see.
What is the reason for that?
I'm sorry?
What is the reason for not buying it?
Okay, so this is where it gets a little more complicated. So if you took seeds from a hybrid plant, remember they have two different parents, and you tried to grow them out, they will not grow out as the same as F1. So you'll get something weird. Sometimes it reverts to one or the other parents, and sometimes it's something completely different. If you collected seeds from an heirloom or an open pollinated, you're going to get the same variety, the same thing. Okay, days to maturity. Again, let's look at New Girl. If you look across, there's F1, and then there's a company code, and then it says 62 days. That means it's 62 days to maturity when you're actually going to get fruit. And we'll look at something a little later on that talks about how that can be to your advantage by having something with lesser days to maturity. Pelleted, you'll see that sometimes in the catalog. For instance, the carrots and the lettuce, certain varieties of them are pelleted, and that means that there's just a coating, usually it's clay or something organic, that is covering the seed and makes it bigger so that when you go to distribute the seeds, you get a more even distribution. An annual is a plant that lives its entire life cycle in 1 year. So where we live, where we have seasons, most of our vegetables are considered annuals. But if you grew them in a controlled environment in a greenhouse, like a tomato or a pepper or something like that, they could be considered a perennial, which can live for many years. Our vegetables are considered annuals because they die when the frost comes, or if you're growing a winter garden, they die, they go to seed and die when it starts to warm up. An example of a perennial in our environment would be like an asparagus or an artichoke. They produce, they die back, they come back the next year and year after year after year. A biennial is a plant that grows stems and leaves and roots the first year, flowers and fruits the following year, and then dies. So, for example, a carrot. We eat them as an annual, basically, we dig them up the first year when they're growing their roots, their stems, and their leaves. But if you wanted to collect the seeds from them, you would let them grow into the next year, let them flower, collect the seeds, and then they would die. Another example would be, say, parsley is the same kind of thing. You can grow your parsley for a year, you'll still have some the following year, they bolt, they seed, and then they die. Organic, I think everybody knows what organic is, but I really love this definition. Seeds that come from plants grown strictly without the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or the use of sewage sludge, irradiation, or genetic engineering. So again, in this catalog, anything that has an OG next to it is considered organic. I personally don't think it's necessary to buy organic seeds. If I'm growing my plant out in an organic manner, I don't think the seed is going to make that much difference, but that's a personal preference for you. GMO, seeds that are genetically modified by a lab by inserting or removing certain genes to alter the plant's characteristics. So I have a few things to say about this. When you go to the nursery and you buy a packet of seeds and it says non-GMO on it, it makes you think that the other ones might be genetically modified, but that's not the case. A home gardener cannot purchase genetically modified seeds. They're super expensive because they're genetically modified in a lab. And they're grown, or they're supplied to commercial farmers, and the farmers actually have to sign a contract with the company that does the genetic engineering that they won't, after they've grown their crop out, that they won't collect those seeds and replant those seeds, that they have to buy new seeds from the company every year. Determinate versus indeterminate. This mostly applies to tomatoes. You have a question?
Yeah, so what would happen if you bought your produce at the grocery store and then collected the seeds and that happened to be a GMO plant at the grocery store?
That's possible, but there's only certain varieties that are genetically modified. So I think corn, soybeans, there's a couple of others, but I can't remember what they are. Cotton, I think, is one of them.
Wheat.
Wheat?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't think wheat was one of them, but it might be, yeah. So that's something to consider, I suppose. So determinate plant is a plant that grows to a certain point and then stops. It has a shorter stature overall, and usually the fruit all comes in at once. So if you have a small garden, you might choose a determinate variety because they're usually bush kind of varieties. And if you're a canner and you make sauces and salsas and whatever, you want your fruit to all come in at once. So if you're, growing, you want to do tomato sauces, let's say, you want as much fruit to come in as possible at the same time. So a determinate variety might be something that you would choose.
I always buy early growth bush because it's determinate.
Yeah.
But that tomato produces all summer. Doesn't just do one big.
Yeah, I've had that too. They do the big, but then they produce a little bit. Yeah.
So
That's not true for all of them though, but early girl is one of them. And then indeterminate is one that grows and sets fruit the entire growing season. So if you want fresh tomatoes just for sandwiches or salad or whatever, you would choose a tomato that's an indeterminate. They tend to be vining, they tend to need a lot more room. So if you don't have the room for them to sprawl, you would need to stake them or trellis them. Okay, so reading codes in the catalog. So there are, as I said, many diseases that are possible, but thankfully we don't live in a humid environment, so a lot of those diseases that are common to the humid areas in the United States, we don't have those problems. So these are the ones that I know of here where we live. These are the most common ones. So the first is nematodes. So nematodes are actually a little pest. It's a little tiny roundworm whose larva feeds on the roots of your vegetables. And so last summer, I had a vegetable bed, a tomato bed with about 10 tomatoes in it. And they were tomatoes that I've grown before that I know have really a good production rate, are always very vigorous, and they looked terrible. They started losing leaves. They didn't look very good. They weren't producing any fruit. And finally, 2 of them died, and I pulled them out, and this is what I saw. So these are galls where the larva is feeding on the roots of your plant. So if you ever see this, what you would do is you would look for the code N in your catalog. So let's look at, again, page 117. The next one down, Big Beef Plus. The second line of all these little letters has an N. And there's many in here, different varieties of vegetables that have an N. So anything that I grow in that bed again for the next few years is going to have the N code on it, so that those plants will be resistant to whatever, to these nematodes that are going to be living in the soil for a while. Another big problem here is Fusarium wilt and Verticillium wilt. It's a disease of it's actually a pathogen that lives in the soil for many, many, many years. You could bring it in on a plant that you purchased. I think mine came, I have it, I think it came when I purchased soil, commercial soil, not bagged soil, but in bulk. And so I've had it for years in certain beds, and I always have to buy varieties that either have the F or the V on them. So this is how it looks with the tomato, and you would purchase something with an F or a V. Fusarium wilt occurs in many different varieties of plants, and it looks like your plant will start looking like it needs water, and it does, because the vascular system has been compromised and it can't pull up the water that it needs. This disease lives in your soil for years and years and years. It's really hard to get rid of, so you should always try, once you experience it, always put in plants that are resistant to these varieties. And I've, over the years, forgotten sometimes, to double check to make sure I have the resistant variety in whatever the beds are that I had the problem, and inevitably the plants die. Mosaic virus is another one that we see around here sometimes. So you'll get these leaves that are kind of mottled looking, and then these little blisters here, you'll start getting more and more of these blisters. And mosaic virus occurs in many, many plants. So you would look for the variety that had a something MV. So there, like I said, there's all kinds. Here's some examples. There's also zucchini mosaic virus. There's, I think it's called curly top beet mosaic virus. So there's many types of this type of disease. I just want to point out here this tobacco mosaic virus. Tobacco is in the same family as potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. So even though it's called tobacco mosaic virus, it can affect those particular plants in that family. And then another common one we have here is powdery mildew. It affects a lot of different types of plants. And as it sounds, it looks like you just drop some powder on the leaves. And again, same thing, you would choose a variety that had the PM code for powdery mildew. So there's lots of things on the market that say that they'll protect you against some of these diseases. They don't work very well. The best way that you can protect your plants and not have these diseases is to choose varieties that are resistant to whatever that disease is. There was a question?
The mosaic virus, does that kill the plant or just make it look different but still producing?
I think it ultimately can kill it. It loses vigor tremendously, and then it won't fruit anymore. Anybody else? Okay. So let's just go over a few things that we can address that happen in the garden that I might have already mentioned. So one of the things I hear every summer here is my tomatoes did not produce. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is too much nitrogen. But one of the main reasons here is the extended periods of heat that we have. And what happens is the pollen becomes too dry and it becomes unviable, and it will not pollinate the female part of the plant. So you go that whole summer with the flowers falling off and you don't get any fruit. And another problem is cracking because of the heat. There's a couple of reasons for cracking, but one of them is because of heat. So one of the things you could do is try heat-tolerant varieties. So here again, on page 117, if you looked at Estiva, the third one down, There's a little triangle there that indicates it's good for a greenhouse, but right next to it is the sun coming up with the heat radiating off of it. This is considered to be an extremely heat-tolerant variety. There's many other heat-tolerant varieties that don't have that code in here, but things like, well, even some Early Girl is mentioned. That's a great one. Celebrity can be a good one. It can get some cracking, but it does produce during the summer. But there's other things you can do. You can choose shorter days to maturity. So again, if you looked at this New Girl up here, 62 days to maturity. Anything below 70, 72, something like that, will give you the opportunity for your plant to produce some fruit before the heat of the summer hits. And then you just have to live through the heat of the summer. When it cools down some more, you'll start getting vegetables again. People tell me that during the summer when their plants aren't producing, they just tear them out, which is crazy to me, because once it cools down, that's when we actually get the best production for vegetables here. Question?
Can you help them with shade and misting or things like that?
You can help them to some degree with shade cloths and things like that actually help a lot with the cracking and the sunburn that can happen. We've tried different things. People tell me that yes, shade cloths do help to some degree, but I personally don't think it's helped us that much. Do try to keep a lot of leaf cover though on your plants. Some people prune their vegetables, and there's reasons for it, but where I live at 2,100 feet, it is so hot that I think it's important to keep as many leaves as you can on the plant. The other thing is cherry tomatoes. So you should always have some cherry tomatoes in your garden, cherry tomatoes, grape tomatoes, that kind of thing, because they're not as susceptible to the heat of the summer. They'll continue to produce all summer long. And then with regard to cracking, there's all kinds of varieties on the market that are crack resistant. Certain varieties are more prone to cracking, and you just kind of learn that over time. But like here on 117, Abigail, the highlighted one in the yellow highlighting, in there it says fruit with less cracking. So there's lots of them in here that are resistant of cracking. But cracking doesn't hurt your tomato. You just have to cut that little part off that's cracking. Okay, so if your cracking goes concentrically around the belly button, the blossom, where it hooks to the stem, that's because you've overwatered. Or if it's going to rain and you know it's a big storm coming and you have a lot of any fruit in your vegetable garden, especially tomatoes, because tomatoes you can pick early and just let them ripen in the window. But what happens is that the water comes and the plant sucks all that water up, and it expands the fruit so much that it breaks the skin. But if the cracking is from the scar or the belly button or whatever you want to call it going outwards, that's usually just from heat or the particular variety. Let's say you live in Jersey Dale. You would choose cold tolerant varieties. So there are a number of cold tolerant varieties, all kinds of different vegetables, as you can see in the catalog. As far as tomatoes go, there's a number of varieties that were developed in Russia. And I know there's a few varieties that start with the word Alaska. So you might try those. And again, you would choose shorter days to maturity because you just have that little window of opportunity for production. So you would choose varieties that have fewer days to maturity. So we've already talked enough about disease, I think, and we talked about the nematodes. And with regard to limited space, you would choose determinate varieties or bush varieties. So I want to do a little exercise here. It was a lot of information, and maybe it'll help reinforce some of the things I've said. It's a test. So let's turn to page 124. These are all Roma and paste tomatoes. Who can tell me the two varieties that are not hybrids?
Granadero and San Marzano.
So Granadero has a F1 next to it. That means it's a hybrid. But you were right about the San Marzano. What's the other one?
Speckled rum.
Right, okay. Which is the one that Johnny's considers the easiest to grow? Name one variety that's appropriate for a container. You might have to look at your little codes down at the bottom.
First one was sunrise sauce.
Yes, perfect. Yes, so sunrise sauce, that's the upper left there, has a little flower pot next to it. That's the indication that it's appropriate for a container. Tell me one variety that's appropriate for Jersey Dale. I can't hear you. Anybody? Okay, sunrise sauce, again, because there's fewer days to maturity. It's got the least number of days to maturity.
Upper left, right below the sunrise sauce.
Yeah.
Oh, 57 days, yeah. See, I was looking for that little snow.
Oh, that's cold tolerance. Name the best variety or the best choice for a hot location.
Oh, that was
Speak up. Anybody? Okay, again, sunrise sauce, because it's the fewer days to maturity and you'll get some produce before the heat of the summer hits. Okay, one last one. Name me the two varieties that are resistant to fusarium and verticillium wilt. Anybody? Yes, that's right. Speak up.
Granite Arrow was pomegranate.
Okay, so it's Granadero and Verona. So if you look under Verona, top middle column, 67 days to maturity, there's an F and there's a V. With the parentheses next to the F, there's actually 4 races of fusarium wilt. In order to know what you have to take it to a lab. You don't want to bother with that. Just try to get stuff that has an F and a V. Okay, Verona and Granadero. Any questions before we move on?
What's the numbers after the F? What are they? The little F.
Oh, yeah, it's fusarium wilt, and there's 4 races of fusarium wilt.
What does the one mean?
That's what I just said. So there's 4 races. You'll see F1. You'll see F with a 1 in parentheses, F with a 2, F with a 3, F with a 4. You won't know what those are as a home gardener. Just try to get stuff that's fusarium wilt resistant. Unless you take it to a lab and then you get it identified.
And if it has the big F1, it's hybrid, but all the rest are not.
Right.
Okay.
I was going to ask a question about the rootstock seeds,
Uh-huh.
which is on page 114.
Okay. And your question is?
I don't think I've seen that before, so how would you use that?
Okay, well, I have some growing out right now. I've done it one other time. So it's a little tricky, but for certain varieties, like heirlooms that don't produce very well, or don't have a lot of vigor, are not disease resistant, you can start seeds that are rootstock that are bred to be disease resistant and have more vigor and so forth. So you grow them out just like a regular tomato, and then when they get to a certain size, about that big, you cut diagonally the top of whatever the tomato is that you want, and you cut the top off the rootstock and the bottom off the tomato you want, and there's these little plastic clips that you buy, and you put the 2 pieces together diagonally, and you clip them with this silicone clip, and you let them grow together. And that gives you, say, a Cherokee Purple, which isn't a big producer, can have diseases. It will help it grow more vigorously. It'll give you the disease protection that the rootstock had, and probably more vigor. I mean, not more vigor, more production. So I did it 1 year. I think I started 6 and I got 1. So it's a little tricky to graft them. But the root on that thing was just gigantic. And it produced fruit, and it It didn't have any disease problems, and it seemed very healthy the whole time. So we're trying it again this year.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so so we're going to go on. So you've got your seeds started, or you haven't gotten your seeds started. You've purchased your seeds, and I just want to say, we're going to go on to how you start them, but I just want to say that the nurseries would have you believe that every year you have to buy fresh seeds, but that's not the case. Seeds can last a long time depending on what the variety is, and in your handout and here you have a list of different vegetables and what their expectation is for their seeds to be viable. I actually think mine last a lot longer. As long as you're storing your seeds in a cool, dry place where insects can't get to them, they'll last a lot longer. So the tomatoes, for instance, the tomatoes I brought today, some of them were from a packet that was 10 years old. So if you're not sure if your seeds are viable or whether the production rate is going to be good enough, you can do the paper towel test. So take 10 seeds, put them in a wet paper towel in a Ziploc bag, and put them someplace warm. So older model refrigerators are warm on top. Put it on your mantle in a sunny window or something. And out of the 10, if you get all 10 to germinate, you've got 100% possibility of seed germination. If 3 of them germinated, you're only going to get 30%. That might be when you decide that's not worth it, I'm going to buy new seeds. If they don't germinate at all, you better go buy some new seeds.
So the seed packet's only good for like maybe 3 years sometimes, but are you saying that if we were to collect seeds from our tomatoes each year, would that still not only last 3 years, or can you collect every year and it just go on forever and ever, or no?
If you collect your seeds every year, you don't want to collect hybrids. Remember, they won't grow out the same. That's just like fresh seeds. That's the first year, you know. So does that answer the question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just saying that you don't have to buy new seeds every year unless you're not getting them to germinate in your little test. Okay, so now we're going to go think about our vegetable garden. So the first thing you have to do is determine whether you should plant your seeds indoors or outdoors. So obviously we're talking about indoors here, but there are certain varieties that do way better if you plant them directly outside. And so here are those varieties. So as a general rule, anything with a deep root, a carrot, a turnip, a radish, whatever, they do not transplant well. So you would wait till it got warm enough and plant them directly into the soil when the time comes. And then the next thing you have to do is determine your average last frost date here. So in Mariposa, downtown Mariposa, which is about 2,000 feet, the average last frost date is May 15th. But you know, that varies every year. For every 1,000 feet above the 2,000 feet, you add another week. So if you lived at 3,000 feet, it would be May 22nd. But if you don't want to bother with all that, you can go to this place called plantmaps.com. It's a really cool website that has a bunch of different maps and links to different things. You have it in your handout listed. And you can pull up California and you can enlarge it either with your zoom button or with your fingers on your screen. You can enlarge it and enlarge it until you get to where you live. You tap the screen and it will tell you what your average last frost date is. It also has some cool links to your hardiness zone, your plant hardiness zone. Does everybody know what a hardiness zone is? Or I should rephrase it, does anybody not know what a hardiness? You don't? Okay. So the USDA some years ago made 13 regions in California, United States and Canada, and rated them on plant hardiness based on would they survive the winter. And each zone, there's 1 through 13, 1 being the coldest, and 13 being the warmest, and each zone is 10 degrees separated, but only winter. So in your handout, there's some links to a couple other things like sunset zones is considered the gold standard for determining hardiness in California, in the West, I should say, because they take into consideration not just the cold temperature in the winter, but how long the seasons are where we live, the rain averages, the I can't even think what else. How hot it gets during the seasons. It takes in a lot more consideration. So most people prefer to use the sunset hardiness zones, but they're also, the numbers are a little different. I think one has us mostly around 9s. I think sunset mostly has us around 8s, zone 8. Does that make sense? Okay. So like if you went to a nursery that wasn't here, nurseries here are going to sell you plants that are appropriate for where we live. But let's say you bought a plant online, or you went to out of Northern California and bought a plant at a nursery in Mendocino. You would want to know its hardiness zone because it's being sold in a different zone than you live. So if you know your zone, you can see if that plant is going to be appropriate and survive where you live. So you've figured out your last frost date, and you're looking at your seed packet, and you will see here, this is a tomato. It says this is only recommended to plant outside in mild winter climates. We are not a mild winter climate. So then it tells you when to plant it inside. In this case, it's 6 to 8 weeks before your average last frost date. So you're going to take your average last frost date, once you've figured it out, and count backwards 6 to 8 weeks, and that's when you plant your seeds inside. Make sense? What?
I would say now.
2 weeks
Yeah.
ago.
But if you don't want to do that, there's all these neat calculators online. So this happens to be from Johnny's, but there's a lot of others online. And if you put your last average frost date in there and press enter, it will realign all these numbers down here, which tell you how many weeks in advance you're supposed to plant them, what that date range is, when you can plant them outside, how many weeks before, when it's safe to plant them outside, and what those dates might be. So it's all done for you. So you've got your seeds, and it's time to start planting them. Use appropriate containers. There's many, many, many things you can use, but they should be clean. So you can use old pots. You can recycle them. I've seen people make these containers out of newspapers that they fold around this mold. You can use that. I've seen people use egg cartons, which I don't think is appropriate because I don't think it gives your plant enough root space. You can buy fancy equipment, but you don't need it. This is mostly what I use. It assuages my guilt for buying greens in a plastic container. I use them over and over again. And so I just fill it with soil. I don't put holes in it. I'm just careful about how much I water. I put the lid on. I label it because I use them over and over again. I just take a piece of tape. I use a waterproof marker, and I label it. And this is a problem that I have, is sometimes I forget and I think I'm going to know what that is. And inevitably, I don't know what it is once it grows out. I use these when I'm doing, so I grow for the plant sale. I grow a huge volume of plants, and I use these. Sometimes I'll put 6-packs in here. Sometimes I'll just fill the thing with dirt and then make furrows and then put a piece of plastic tape along each furrow telling me what it is. If you're reusing your containers, you should sterilize them with a mix of 9 parts water to 1 part bleach, just in case you had some fungal disease or something going on in there that you didn't know about from when you used it last. Okay, use clean potting mix or starter pellets. So you don't have to buy fancy seed starting soil. Any soil that you purchase commercially. Could be those big bags that are out in the parking lot at the nursery, or it could be something on the shelves inside. Don't use your garden soil. It's true, seeds start in garden soil, but you'll have a better result because the soil you purchase is sterile. It is lighter weight than outdoor soil. It's not going to have any pathogens in it that your garden soil might have. So you're going to have a more controlled situation when it comes to growing out those plants. Starter pellets are something that I used for years and years before I started growing so many plants. And they're these little, sometimes they're peat, thank you, peat. But I don't use the peat, I use the core. Peat is a diminishing resource, and so now most of these are going to core. Core is just ground up coconut shells. You wet it. it expands. You put your little seeds in there. I usually put 2 in there in case one didn't germinate. Squeeze it closed, and the plant grows out in that core material. And then you can just plant the whole thing in the soil. So you're reducing potential shock to the plant because you're not disturbing the roots.
I had a huge problem with those this last year, and I'll just do better this time, but the little netting thing
Yes.
that was around them, it
I was
didn't
just gonna
break
say-
off.
Yes, so I was just going to say that. So the core, in my recollection, the core doesn't have netting. This is a peat that I have had for years, and it does have netting. So it does help if you tear that little tiny netting off. So seeds should be planted 2 to 4 times their diameter. Does that make sense? Okay, so you have a squash seed, it's this big, you're going to plant it that deep. So 2 to 4 times the size of the seed, unless it's a really tiny seed. So little tiny seeds only need to be pressed oil. You don't want to bury them. Often tiny seeds require light to germinate, so that's another reason why we just press them into the soil. Label them as I mentioned. Provide something to maintain humidity. So I think this is a crucial thing to starting seeds, and that's why I like these, because you can just put a lid on them and it maintains humidity, and it has this sort of greenhouse effect where the water starts to collect on the bottom of the lid and then it falls back down onto the soil. It reduces your need to water them as regularly. You might not have to water them at all until the lid comes off, and it provides a little more heat, and so it really helps a lot. If you don't have any plastic, something to put over your your seeds, just use plastic wrap. That's what we're going to give you today to go home with on whatever the seeds that you plant. We're just going to give you some plastic wrap, rubber band it down. But okay, provide light as needed. So some seeds need light, particularly small seeds like dill, lettuce need light to germinate. Most seeds don't care. They're going to be under the soil anyway, so it's dark in there. But I gave you a little handout that talks about which seeds need light and which need dark, but mostly they don't care. Provide a heat mat or other source of warmth. So a heat mat is well worth the investment. You don't have to have the kind with a thermostat on it that are a lot more expensive. Just a simple heat mat that you plug in. It helps tremendously. But for years and years, I didn't have heat mats. So I just took these, I stacked them on top of each other, put them on my mantle over my wood burning stove, and it caused the seeds to germinate. So any place that's warmer, a warm sunny window, but it has to be like, it can't be a window that gets cold, you know, during the winter like we're having now. Like I said before, sometimes on top of older model refrigerators, it's quite warm, so that might be a possibility for you. But again, I think a heat mat is well worth it. As soon as your seeds germinate, I mean, not just one, but maybe you have a quarter of them germinating, take the lid off. Because once they germinate and you are providing too much humidity, then they'll either begin to rot or, I forgot, yeah, they'll just start to rot. So you want to have the lid off as soon as they germinate. And then place them under strong light. So even if your seed started in the dark, as soon as it germinates, it has to be in strong light. Might be a window, but again, a grow light is a huge thing. They're not that expensive anymore. I find them online, they're not terribly expensive. They're so worth it. But if you can't do that, put them in a sunny window. They'll get a little leggy, but you can remedy that as time goes by. And then what I think the most important thing of all is close observation. So I kind of joke that it's like having a baby. You wouldn't leave your baby in the crib all day and not check on it. Seeds dry out really fast, and once they dry out, they're goners. If you end up with something like damping off, a few of them start looking like they're dying, you'll want to take some action to try to remedy that problem and save the rest of them. So check on them at least a couple times a day. Don't go on vacation and leave them sitting with no attention.
Are all of these slides available online? Do you have them set up so that we can just go online
We're
and
sharing.
drop all these and
We
print them all?
can.
Where's Sherry?
I'm here. We can tell them I can put it, if I put it on my computer from your flash drive, I'll put it on the website.
But, you know, a lot of the slides come in and out, so you won't, unless you have PowerPoint, you won't get that. But Dan is videotaping it, and we're going to put it up on the UCCE YouTube channel. Okay, so you could find us in your handout. It talks about useful YouTube channels.
Yes.
It'll be on that. But give us a couple weeks to edit it. Okay, so you've planted your seeds and you've planted them too close together, which happens especially when you have smaller seeds. And you're going to need to thin them, so you would thin out the weaker ones, but don't go pulling them up. Take a pair of scissors and cut the weaklings off at the ground to let the stronger ones thrive. By pulling them up, you're disturbing the roots of the ones that are stronger, and you might kill them as well. And then finally, transplanting into a bigger container, you have to wait until the seedling is big enough. So this is an immature seedling. These are called cotyledon leaves. They're not real leaves. They're sometimes called seed leaves, and they're actually the part that emerges from the seed itself. So you would wait till you have at least a few true leaves. So these are true leaves, and these are cotyledon leaves before you transplant. So I actually had a bunch of tomatoes that I was going to bring that I started, I don't know, a month or so ago. And I looked at them yesterday, and not all of them had their true leaves yet, so I had to improvise and bring some other tomato plants. So if you have a really small plant, like a lettuce, you might want to wait till you have more than one set of true leaves. So it just depends on the size of the plant. Can anybody tell me what plant hardening is?
Sharks outside so they can experience the weather before you actually stick them in the ground.
And how do you just stick them outside?
I thought so.
Okay. So no, you're doing it slowly. So you're acclimating your plants to the heat, to the cold, to the wind, to the sun intensity outside. But you only do that a little bit at a time. So your seedlings have been lounging around on your sunny window, having a vacation, and you can't just stick them outside because the shock will kill them. So you do it a little bit at a time. I'm super conservative about it. So you should start at least 1 to 2 weeks before you're transplanting out in the garden. I usually start a lot sooner because I want my plants to keep growing and maturing so that I'll have an earlier start on the season. And I typically, you're not supposed to put them out above, until it's at least 45 degrees, but I'm conservative about that, and I wait till it's at least 50 out, and it's not raining, and it's not blowing gusty wind. So you'd put them someplace protected, like a sort of semi-shady the first day for maybe, depending on how hot it is outside, maybe 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, and you increase that every day for a couple of weeks until they're acclimated to the outside. And what happens is the cuticle and the waxy coating hardens off, and that's why it's called hardening. And putting them outside like that stimulates root growth, and you'll notice a big surge in growth once they start going outside.
Sorry, this 45 degrees you have there, this is like when like the coldest it gets, or the?
You don't want to put them out under 45 degrees.
This is the soil
At least, no, the temperature outside, when you bring them outside to be exposed to the sun a little bit at a time.
Thank you.
Okay, so some of you already have a vegetable garden, I think, and maybe some of you are just starting, having never chosen a vegetable garden. So we're going to start with choosing a site. So you have to have at least 6 to 8 hours of sun a day, especially things like tomatoes and corn and eggplant and peppers. They need a lot of sun. If you can, provide some wind protection. So my vegetable garden is along the side of a wall so that the house protects it somewhat. And it's on a south-facing wall, and I take advantage of that in the winter when I grow snap peas, which normally can't grow outside in a normal garden. They're up against the wall, which radiates heat under a little overhang, and I can produce cooler season varieties by having them on that south wall. Close to a water supply. Lots of people don't think about this, but you don't want to be dragging your hoses around, and if you're going to put in an irrigation system, you want to keep it simple and have your water supply close by. Close to the house. So this is my theory. If your garden is way out there, you're not going to go out there on a regular basis to check on it. And I'm a big proponent of you should walk in your garden every single day to see what's going on, because you can catch infestations, you can catch gophers that are coming around, you can see when a rabbit has come in and chewed on your plants, and take action to protect your plants. You can see if diseases are happening. And birds are another big thing in my garden, at least, because somebody in my household likes to invite the birds in, so they're always after my vegetables. So you can provide protection for them. Predator protection, enough said about that. Good quality soil. So this is kind of a problem where we live. You either have clay soil, or you have decomposed granite, or you have rocky soil because we have so much granite in our soil. If you have good soil, lucky you, but most of us don't. So I recommend a raised bed, and then purchasing bulk soil. Don't go buy the bags, individual bags. It's too expensive that way. You can buy bulk soil. Here in Mariposa, you can buy bulk soil at Bootjack Feed. And in Oakhurst, there's Oakhurst Rock. They usually have some, but call ahead because they don't always have it. Good drainage. Level ground. Okay, so this is, you'd think, a no-brainer, but I have a neighbor that I helped start a vegetable garden a couple of years ago, and he wanted to start it on the hillside, till I explained to him that the water is all going to run downhill and you're not going to be getting water to your vegetables. Now, you could grow on a hillside if you terraced it, but you know, probably a big hassle. If you have a better place, you should use it. And then not under oak trees. So our native oaks are very sensitive to water in the summer, and too much water will kill them. So if you want to keep your oak trees, don't plant your vegetable gardens near your oak trees. Then, if you already have a vegetable garden, or have had one, you want to prepare your soil every year. And I'm a big proponent of no-till. It used to be back in the day that it was recommended that you either rototilled or turned your soil over every spring before you planted your garden. That's not recommended anymore. It's been scientifically proven that you're disturbing the valuable organisms in your soil. You're disturbing, you're bringing weeds to the surface. Every time you bring soil up from the bottom, there's fresh weeds to grow. There's just so many reasons why you're harming your soil by doing that. And even when you plant, you should just crack the soil and put your plant in. And this is a big rule in my opinion: dress or mulch your soil all the time. You should always have your soil covered. You reduce, it provides so much good health to your garden. It prevents weeds. And there's all kinds of things you can use. You can see here: compost, aged manures, wood chips, straw, newspaper, dry leaves, pine needles, and comfrey leaves. I grow comfrey. It's been scientifically proven that comfrey, the plant, is a very deep-rooted plant, and it mines minerals deeper in the soil and brings them up to your leaves. So when the season is ended in the fall, I take those comfrey leaves and I just throw them on top of the soil, and over time they start to decompose and bring nutrients to the soil. And here's all the reasons why you should cover your soil all the time with something organic. It reduces foliar diseases, so when you're out there watering, or your overhead spray irrigation system, the water lands on a soil that's not protected. Pathogens the water gets bounced back up into the leaves, so pathogens can be brought onto your plant when your soil isn't covered. It warms the soil earlier in the season, it cools it during the summer, it conserves moisture, prevents weeds, produces nutrients, improves the soil structure, it encourages the soil organisms to break down all that organic material, and when they break that down, they're producing nutrients to your soil. And it improves aeration over time. So this is one of my winter garden beds. In this case, there's straw on it. We make our own compost. If we don't have enough, we'll go buy compost or mushroom compost. I have chickens. They bed in shaved pine, so all that gets scraped out and thrown on the beds at the beginning of the winter, and then the winter rains water all that stuff into the soil. I don't dig it in. Over time, those organisms come up and consume that organic matter and break it down for you. Avoid working the soil when it's wet because it causes compaction. Avoid walking on planting beds for the same reason. Grow a cover crop during fallow periods. Fallow being that's the period of time when you have nothing growing in your beds. So over the winter is a good time to do that. So different cover crops do different things. So legumes, which are peas, beans, clover, and vetch, provide nitrogen.
I'm sorry, but what is grow cover crops?
Okay, so I'm talking about them right here. So you would plant certain varieties of plants over the winter, and they provide different benefits. So legumes, peas, beans, clover, and vetch. You can buy cover crops at the nursery or online or in a catalog, and you plant those, and they grow over the winter, and they provide nutrients to the soil. And then if you have really dense soil, you can try barley and rye and legumes because they have deep, dense roots and can help break up the soil. And then the decaying roots open up the channels for water and oxygen penetration. So at the end of the season, or the beginning of the spring, but at the end of the winter season, when you want to get rid of your cover crop, just come and cut the tops off and leave the roots, because the roots will start to decay and provide nutrients to the soil, and again, provide channels for water and oxygen. So then, don't throw away your cover crop. I mean, what I do is I just leave it on the soil, cut it down, and then, open it up where I'm going to plant things, because they're going to break down over time. It will provide a kind of mulch. So I do this thing called chop and drop. So at the end of the growing season, I take a lot of the dying vegetables or dead vegetables that are healthy, that haven't been affected by some kind of disease or nematodes, and I chop them up and I just drop them onto the soil. So right here we have, this is from the year before, of fava bean stalks. They don't break down very easily. It's going to take a few years, but it provides a cover for the soil, and eventually it'll all break down. So always cover your soil. Okay, so it's time to transplant your seedlings. You've hardened them off, so you have to wait for the appropriate temperature. So you kind of know when your last frost date is, but again, it's just not that easy. It's well known that we get snowstorms sometimes in the middle of May, maybe even later if you're a higher elevation. So the average last frost date is just an estimation. You have to refine it. So what I do is I go to AccuWeather.com, which is in your handout too, and I take a longer look at what's going on. So I'm looking here, and all these darker numbers are the daytime temperatures. These are the nighttime temperatures. And I'm looking the next few weeks out, and I see this. 38 degrees at night. 38 degrees at my house might mean 32 degrees or less. And I don't want to have my plants in the soil with the potential of that happening. So if I did plant them out, I would have to provide some kind of protection. So you could put 1-gallon pots over your plants, you could put boxes over your plants, you would do something to protect them for a potential frost. But I prefer, if possible, to just keeping my plants outside in their pots until I'm absolutely sure that there's no more possibility of frost. Okay, plant only as deep as they were in their starting medium. So this is a problem that even our master gardeners have when they come to my house to work on potting up plants that we've started for the plant sale. Sometimes they just get planted too deeply. So when you take a seedling, you want to notice, I'll show you a picture in a minute. You want to notice where the stem starts and where the root section begins. And you don't want to plant it any deeper than it was in the original soil that it was in. But there's some exceptions. So the two exceptions are tomatoes and tomatillas. Those plants grow roots along their stem and can be beneficial to be planted a little deeper so that roots develop and you have a stronger root system, stronger plant overall. Okay, so here is the picture I wanted to show you. So right here is sort of the crown, and here it is in the soil. You don't want to plant it in the soil up here or have the roots out above the soil. Now this is an exception because this is a tomato, so you could conceivably, in the case of a tomato, take these leaves off and plant it in the soil all the way up to here, and it will grow roots all the way down here.
Helen, what about, I'm reading how with tomatoes you can actually plant them sideways?
Yeah, I took that picture out. It was in my original program, but I was trying to shorten the program. So in my garden, they're in raised beds. The raised beds are only about that big. I mean, you can do raised beds that are a lot higher. If you have a back problem, it's great to have a tall raised bed, but I digress. So because they're only that deep, the soil is only about that deep, and underneath the soil is hardware cloth wire because we have a gopher problem. So I dig a trench. I take the leaves off most of the tomato plant and just leave the few top leaves, and I lay it sideways. I flex the stem sideways and lay it in the trench and then cover it up. And then roots will grow out from that trench. Okay. Okay, so once you have transplanted your plant, you want to firm the soil around the roots, and then you want to water it in to settle the soil around the roots. And that's it for me. Any questions?
Are there any benefits to planting the tomato sideways and planting it deeper?
If your soil is deep enough that you can plant it deep, no, there's no advantage to it. It's just that I have the wire there and I can't plant it any deeper. Anybody else? This lady, I'll get you in a minute.
If you're going from seed to seedling to plant, do you step them up in the size of the container? And at what point do you say, you just stay there until I put you outside?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think you're asking me when do I decide to transplant?
Yes,
Okay, so first of all, have your true leaves.
yeah.
And then it depends on, so if you saw that one picture where there were tons of seedlings in there. You want to get them out of there as soon as you can, as soon as they have their true leaves, because you don't want to crowd them. It will slow their growth tremendously. So as soon as they get their true leaves, you would transplant them in, and I use these, something like this, or a 6-pack to give them a little more space. And once they start growing, the bigger they get, the bigger the pot has to be, because you want to give them enough root room, so to speak. Does that answer your question?
Yes, where I lose them is going from a 6-pack size to that size.
Did they have true leaves?
Yes. Yeah, they're little plants at that point, but
What kind of plant?
I don't know, just about anything, peppers, tomatoes.
Okay, so peppers are super forgiving. So, I mean, we're not supposed to do this, but, we plant up to 30 seeds in a single cell because we don't have the space for the production that we want to do. And we often take them and transplant them before they get their true leaves, but you really shouldn't do that. We just have to do it because of the size issue. So it surprises me because tomatoes are super forgiving. You can really kind of beat them up and they'll still survive. But peppers are more sensitive. So are you watering them in?
Yeah, I think it's more the continuous water or lack of continuous water.
Okay.
I just wondered if there was something that you had to watch for.
Well, too much water and too little water, definitely. But you have to remember, you're also shocking them when you're making the transplant. So you might lose some anyway. But what happens? Do they just wilt?
Yeah.
Okay. Are they inside or outside when that happens?
They're inside, but cold temperature.
Okay, so that's a problem we've had this year. A lot of the master gardeners we're all like, oh, our plants for the plant sale, it's terrible. I have never had tomato seedlings die on me. And I've had quite a few die this year, and it's because it's so cold. The soil needs to be warm. And if the soil, for a warm season, I want to clarify that. If you're growing vegetables for the winter, they want cool soil, and you want to germinate in a cooler environment. But these are summer plants that we're talking about, and because it's so cold and we can't put them outside every day because it's either raining, snowing, frosting, or blowing wind, they're not getting warm enough, so they just collapse. And it's about the cold soil. And you had a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, I transplanted broccoli, but broccoli, when they always grow, I always go kind of sideways. And so.
Is it the variety?
Different varieties.
Okay.
And so I'm thinking, well, should I plant them where down deep so that they're always sticking up straight, or should I transplant them so that they're just going sideways?
Well, you don't want to plant a broccoli deep because same thing. You just want to plant it
where
at its crown. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's just an issue of the variety. Are they going to seed really quick after that?
No.
Okay, maybe it's just the variety.
Could be. And I do different varieties, I come different stuff.
Okay.
You lost me on why you putting the tomatoes sideways.
Because my bed is too shallow. I have raised beds and I have wire underneath. So the roots, I can't dig down into there because of the wire being there.
I was going to ask, when do you plant a winter garden? And what do you plant?
Where do you live? Where? In town? Okay, so, well, here's an issue. So this is another reason why you might want to start inside. If you're starting a winter garden, seeds, generally speaking, in cold season varieties, don't germinate or do well in the heat of summer. And so you would start them inside in a cooler environment with cooler soil in order to get them to germinate. And then you would keep them inside till that heat was over with. So it kind of depends on where, it depends on what you're growing to. So typically I'll start my lettuces and things like that maybe in late October, November, kale, things like that. You're asking what else would we grow outside? So lots of greens, garlics. Garlic you would start directly in the soil. Onions. What else, Dan?
Arugula.
Oh yeah, arugula. Well, arugula, just let it go to seed and it'll supply you arugula all year long, even in the heat. Chard, yeah. So mostly leafy greens.
Do you do any root vegetables?
Well, carrots they do better before it gets too hot. So starting them earlier would be a good thing. Any of the root vegetables like beets and, I mean, if you could start beets probably now, and actually probably should have started them earlier. What else? So root vegetables, yeah. I'm trying to think what else. So I mostly think of greens in my garden. Anybody else?
Well, I planted my potatoes in the middle of February. And they're just starting to come up, that we had a really nice frost. I just live up the highway. And so it kind of damaged some of the leaves. I should have thought of putting something over them. But the potatoes, I always plant them in February.
I just leave my potatoes in the ground and go harvest them when I need them.
Yeah.
And we did have a terrible frost and they all died back, but I know they'll come back, so I'm not too worried about that. I don't know why our speaker's buzzing, but. Okay, go ahead.
If you're container gardening, is there a minimum amount of soil or size pot that you should grow in?
It depends. What are you growing? What are you thinking of growing?
Tomatoes and peppers.
Yeah, I'd probably I'd buy a variety that's a bush variety or a determinate variety, or one that's indicated as being appropriate for a container, and probably, like that. Okay. And, not just pots, but they have those bags now, those felt bags that you can grow in. Anybody else?
I noticed in your pictures that you had a brick surrounded garden.
Yeah, that was a kind of a temporary thing for me, yeah. With cinder blocks.
Cinder blocks, so those aren't deep enough, or?
It works in my garden. And over the years I've constantly kept the soil covered with organic material and it breaks down, and so even below what used to be terrible soil has improved somewhat.
So I could do that. 1 year I did do because gophers are really bad, I put the chicken wire, the smaller chicken wire, and the roots seem to go underneath that too.
Yeah, but you'll still get some hang up on it. And if you're transplanting, when we're asking about transplanting in the tomato, you can't dig into that wire. And I highly recommend hardware cloth wire, which is that wire that has the little tiny squares. It's more expensive, but it lasts forever. Or maybe not forever, but a long, long time, much longer than the chicken wire.
One more thing. I was talking to my friend, Stan Daughter Stan, and he said that he planted 1 year his tomatoes in a tire, and he said they did super well. But I wasn't sure if that was healthy. Have you ever done that in tires?
Okay, so I haven't planted vegetables in tires because I do worry about maybe some leaching of the rubber material. But I do grow some flowers in them, and that's fine. But the downside is once the roots, especially if it's a perennial, the roots get like the ones we have now. The roots are so dense, we're never going to get them out of that tire. I don't think it had anything to do with the tire. It might be because he was putting commercial soil in, and that was an improvement over maybe him growing in the native soil.
He thought it was the heat blasting.
That could be, yeah, maybe. because there are people that, it's a whole nother story, but there's this red vinyl or plastic that you can buy, and it's been proven by the university research that that red plastic, if you put it on the ground under your tomato plant, the way the light waves that it radiates improves the vigor of your tomato plant. I tried it one year, I didn't really notice anything different, but it's scientifically proven that it works.
Last question. Do you have any advice on strawberries? Because I've never been able to grow them, but I keep buying them.
Okay, come to our plant sale. The variety of tomatoes that we grow is strawberries, are sequoias. And my son jokes that they're like strawberries on steroids. I have grown, I think I started with less than a dozen. The nursery didn't have a dozen, and I've probably had them for 14 years. I have given away and sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And the strawberries, at some point in the season, I'm like, I just don't want to pick any more strawberries. I'm just going to let them die. It's ridiculous how vigorous they are. So yeah, that's somebody else might be growing some other strawberries, but we're growing sequoias.
Or like they do in the city where they have these little funny mounds.
We just grow them in the raised bed, and then they throw their new babies over the edge, and that's what we collect and root for the sale. What?
When is the sale?
April 29th. Okay, so we're going to if there's no more questions, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to provide you with some seeds and some tomatoes to transplant, and our master gardeners will do a little supervision and help you out if you're not very good at it. Feel free to ask questions as we go along.